And you know, I grew up in a society that wasn't riding cars, driving cars. No one owned a car except very wealthy people, and everyone walked. My father used to like to pick up the ladies because he used to love to hear their gossip. And I can remember sitting in the car and knowing why we were darn lucky.
Ruth was actually what I would call a privileged child. And when she graduated high school, she went on to college, I believe. But she had choices. And one of her choices was to go to New York and pursue a singing career. And I believe she worked at ABC, CBS, a recording studio, and there are recordings of Ruth's voice. Very operatic, very beautiful. And she actually kept her voice her entire life, because sometimes when she visited you, she would break into song to show her vitality, that she still retained her voice.
I can't avoid them even now and then.
But she was told by a family friend that going into the entertainment industry was not a good moral choice, that it could lead to some sort of like immorality. There would be temptations, there would be people that might take advantage of her. And so she chose not to pursue it any further.
If as I told you, I worked with an orchestra leader. All I had to do was sleep with the man, and I could have had a job. That's what you had to do.
Well, when I think about Ruth Coxe, I think about there's obviously an intensity there of her personality and presence, but the word that comes to my mind is spry. I can't remember someone who was so spry and so evident, almost like a juvenile, but later in her life she could do things. Her body language was such; it was kind of almost like a dancer, very, very spry and intense. I mean, there was an intensity to any kind of conversation or interaction that you had with her.
Ruth was very different than most of the people around here, and very California kind of progressive hippie scene going on, and there was a lot of shock from all the old school types that lived around here.
And here nobody appreciates anybody, do they?
I thought she was awesome. I thought it was amazing that this one woman could be so powerful to get everyone upset. And I also, from what I understood of what she was asking for, it seemed to make a lot of sense to me.
I remember going up and talking with her and just being kind of blown away by her strength, her intensity, and her. She was out to convert you. If you had a conversation, she had something that she wanted to share with you. She wanted you to understand her passion, incredible passion for her beliefs. And her beliefs revolved around the importance of organic grains and natural food, avoiding pesticide. Of course, I later learned about her work with La Leche and natural breastfeeding, and it was all part of her worldview, which was, in retrospect, as I think about it now, she was way ahead of her time. Mm-hmm. Ruth Coxe was ahead of her time.
Traveling through any of the farm towns as we used to know them is a different picture these days. Rare is the vegetable stand of the locally grown produce we used to find at frequent intervals on the roadside in those country byways, now diverted by superhighways and viaducts for a society on the go. And rarer still is the small market and restaurant in the town centers, featuring ripened fruits and vegetables from nearby fields and gardens. Vegetables and fruits we generally see are wrapped in plastic, set out in refrigeration-controlled showcases, high-priced and far from fresh tasting and delectable nourishment. We're not aware of who is growing what. or how it's grown. And we've lost our relationship with reality by stopping at a register to pay for this unknown.
Yeah, I guess food was kind of the thing that tied together a lot of her interests.
Every now and then I'd see her at the post office and would say a few hellos and stuff like that. And I remember once or twice having a lengthy conversation. She appeared to me very bright and interested in the things that you've been mentioning in terms of organic, farming and stuff like that. But she would go drive down to the beach club or just go through those stone gates or whatever, and then park on the right side in this next to the sand and the water, and go down and collect the seaweed. And then that was what she'd put it on the plants that she was trying to grow and so forth. And of course, it's very good for fertilizing and stuff.
When she had Stanislaus, I decided to give her my treasured English pram that I had for my children in New York City. It was quite lovely with a navy blue exterior and white leather interior. The next time I saw the pram was one day as I drove into Old Lyme Beach Club. There was Ruth on the edge of the water on the beach, just inside the entrance to the club, loading the pram with seaweed for her garden.
I couldn't take all that nonsense.
She could tell that, in the future, that we were really screwing up our food production, that we were relying on big agricultural practices of use of pesticides and chemicals and things that would be injurious to our bodies and to our overall public health. And so I really respect that she had this kind of farm-to-table ethic way before I remember anyone ever talking about it.
Ruth wanted to acquire some tomato plants. She often grew tomatoes in her greenhouse. And she wanted to acquire the small starter plants from a grower in Preston, Connecticut. And Preston is very confusing to drive around. And I didn't really know where I was going. And we were in the car together. And this is pre-GPS. And she was trying to explain to me which way to go, this or that. And there was the point at which we needed to decide whether to turn left or right. And she got out her crystal, which was on a string. And she dangled it in front of herself and let it take a direction. And she said a sort of a little chant. And in fact, it told us to turn left. I did turn left. I followed her directions, and we did in fact find the grower and the multitude of greenhouses. And there she picked up her tomato plants that she was going to nurture for the summer.
The conversations with her were always interesting, but sometimes occasionally one-sided, where she'd be talking at you rather than really kind of listening. She wanted to make sure and I think she was coming at it from the standpoint she wanted to help you.
She would tell us the stories about the kind of flax bread that she would make, and that we would never get gray hair if we ate her flax bread. Mm-hmm. And she didn't really have gray hair, so maybe there was some truth to it.
I couldn't take all that nonsense.
The first and only time I met Mrs. Coxe, she was at the Big Y supermarket parking lot. She was wandering around the parking lot, looking lost, confused, dazed, disorientated, abandoned, and as always, I like to help people, and I decided that she needed help.
And she was an older age when you met.
And she was probably way into her 80s, if not her 90s, so I could see something was not quite right and she needed assistance. So I went up to her, and she showed herself quite meek and kind of intimidated, or even perhaps you could say afraid. But I didn't realize that wasn't the case. So I helped her shuffle over to my car and offered to give her a ride to wherever she lived, because obviously she was missing a ride for some reason. I gently helped her into my car, buckled her in, and then walked around to the driver's side. Got in the car, and second my door shut, there was a change of personalities like I have never seen. She went from meek to aggressive, from quiet to loud, and from timid to obnoxious within half a second. She started screaming about the president. She started screaming about why we need to wear tinfoil on our heads to protect ourselves from the power lines. She started screaming about why the world and the government are taking over our lives. And then I managed to steer the conversation towards travel, where she told me about her great in-depth travels through South America, which was quite interesting. I asked her where she needed to go, and she told me Old Saybrook, because she had a doctor's appointment. I noticed that her foot was swollen and needed attention. So I drove her unknowingly to Old Saybrook to find her doctors. As we were driving down the main street of Old Saybrook, I started asking her, well, where is her doctor's office? Eventually, there was no doctor's office, and she screamed, "Stop the car," leapt out unaided, and disappeared into somebody's back garden. And that was the last I ever saw of Mrs. Coxe. Driving back into Old Lyme from Old Saybrook across the Baldwin Bridge, a thought popped in my head: did I just take a 90-year-old lady to another town and leave her there and drive away? So to be on the safe side, I decided to call the local police and just ask them their thoughts on it, and if there was something they could advise me on. I called the local police officer and I explained what happened, and his response was, "Please tell me you didn't take Mrs. Coxe to Old Saybrook." And I said, "Oh gee, I think I did."
I'm afraid of the doctors here. They've ruined me, almost killed me, and I don't want to have anything to do with them anymore. And down in Mexico, it's a Catholic nation, and the people are wonderful. This family had me for I don't know how many weeks. They wouldn't accept any rent. They had their own parking lot for my car, and I was only 2 blocks from the church. I sang at the church, and people loved me down there.
There was 2 trips to Papua New Guinea. One, my mother and myself, and then the second one, probably in 71, with really my grandmother, who was in her 80s, and my infant brother and my father, and even my grandmother's 39 Ford Woody. The trip to Papua New Guinea also was stimulated by an article that she read about Fred Hargesheimer, who had crashed during World War II and had been nursed back to health by the natives who fed him breast milk. And this really fired her imagination.
There are so many cultural attachments to the breasts and to breastfeeding. And in many cultures, the breasts are celebrated in ways that honor milk making and the healing properties of milk. And in other cultures, breasts are demeaned and objectified as belonging to everyone but the woman. And so in many ways, she was ahead of her time in caring so deeply about the healing properties, because during the 60s and the 70s in the United States, those were the times where we had the lowest rates of breastfeeding. So the fewest women were breastfeeding than any other time in history. So it was really interesting that she, was so committed to it during that time. That was unusual, because that was a time when women were burning their bras and wanting to be separate from their families and their children and have their own identity.
Okay.
Yet it was still seems like very important to her at that time. So in many ways, she was ahead of her time, because what has followed is all of the science that we have now that actually demonstrates the healing properties of milk. And so she had this kind of intrinsic knowledge before we had the science to back that up.
God knows how Ruth knew I had a baby. She sniffed it out or something, and up she came to the farm with knock, 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 and handed me, like I'm with my brand new baby, I have no idea what I'm doing. She hands me a breastfeeding pamphlet. And she was like, read this. Shut the door. A year later, she showed up at my door and she said, I dropped a pamphlet off for you a year ago. Can I please have it back?
So statistically, somewhere around 80% on average of women begin to breastfeed. But statistically, the majority of those women stop before they wanted to. And that has to do with many barriers that are social. They go back to work, and the workplace is not supportive to them, or they go out in public and get harassed because society is unfriendly, or view the breasts as being obscene instead of what they really are, and that is a method of nurturing one's infant, because it's about more than food.
Yeah, this is when we were living in San Francisco, and somehow she decided to, there was this breast milk bank where people would contribute breast milk for perhaps children who were maybe born prematurely. And so somehow she stole some breast milk from this milk bank. Maybe I was sick or something, and she thought that this would be, like a healing agent for me.
I couldn't take all that nonsense.
My favorite house in Old Lyme was the Thomas Sill house. And I would drive by there or ride my bike by there, and I thought, oh my God, this house is absolutely amazing. I later studied the house a little bit and learned that it, supposedly was built by shipwrights, that it's got these beautiful graduated clapboards. To me, it's just perfectly sited. As you come up Sill Lane, you see it.
But the bigger problem was that Sam died and they didn't have a lot of money, so they never paid taxes on the property. And that caused an auction to happen on the property.
Okay, so 6 or 7 years ago, I was in the town hall paying my taxes on the last possible day of the grace period, July 30th, and no sooner did I finish writing my check that I turned around and Mrs. Coxe was walking in. She had a rather large shopping bag or handbag, which turned out to be full of small denomination bills, with which she was there to pay her taxes as well on the last day. And as she pulled the bundles of bills out, she spent her visit berating everything that there was to do with the tax system and all those involved with the town tax system.
I couldn't take all that nonsense.
There's another side of Ruth that is insanely contentious and not probably willing to admit that she's wrong sometimes, or her views are were, I should say, put it in the past tense, were narrow-minded or maybe not fully considered. And so, there's a complexity there. And I would say, though, there's a complexity about all of us in our lives. I just think with, dare you say, or dare I say, eccentric characters like Ruth Coxe, those complexities are more on view. They're more evident in the personality of the subject. So, I think Ruth's role here in this community was to some degree as a provocateur, as someone who would shake people to think. And I think some people probably reacted, oh, she's just crazy.
Mom tried to smuggle bananas strapped to her waist, pretending she was pregnant. And she was caught.
I bring a song about bananas. I sing it low, I sing it high, yay, yay. It makes you keep forgetting nanos. Sing a song about bananas.
How many Connecticuts are there in the USA? We need to know, because each year that much land goes out of farm use, permanently. When all the farmland is gone, what will it cost us for food raised on layers of skyscraper, or flown in at import prices, or substituted for by chemicals concocted to resemble real food? Anyone who saves one piece of land for growing food is helping to solve that problem. Do you know anyone who is doing that? I do.